I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I stand at the crossroads where global governance, paganism, transhumanism, transformational culture, where all of these kind of converge. And over the many years, I've attended, oh golly, scores of global governance, world federalists, UN events, transformational events. I go to Burning Man, I go to the Parliament of World Religions. This spring, I was at the Eclipse Festival in Texas, between 35 to 40,000 people coming to venerate the sun, hand in hand with literally just like yards away, Elon Musk's guys, NASA leaders, major tech figures. And so you had this blending of shamanism, spirituality, psychedelics, and technology all wrapped up in this one container.
Okay, everyone, welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. Today I'm joined by Vice President of the Kirkwood Center, Lenny Esposito.
Good morning.
To my right. And joined today by Carl Teichrib. Carl, am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm trying to use my German.
Yes, you nailed it. Perfect.
Awesome. Carl's author, writer, journalist from Canada, who has written what I think is a super important book, and that's why I wanted to have him on. The book is right here. It's called Game of Gods, and the subtitle is The Temple of Man in the Age of Reenchantment. So, Carl, thanks for being with us on the podcast. I want to let you kind of introduce yourself and what you've been doing and what the book is about, because I've only been able to get a few chapters in. But I think this topic is so important for the church to be aware of and get a handle on and get a grip on. I'm always the guy who's like trying to look behind the scenes. What are the big ideas that are motivating kind of all the kinds of things we see in the culture, and when I started reading about the sort of one world kind of spirituality and oneism and this kind of pantheistic, I just like, this is it. I mean, this is really what I think is coming down the pike at us. And you've been working on this for a while. So why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself then?
Sure.
And we'll start talking about what you've been researching over the last several years.
All right. No, that sounds great. My name is Carl Teichrib, as mentioned earlier. I'm an author, researcher, and a lecturer on, well, you could look at maybe call it this way, the big paradigm shifts that are taking place across the Western world. And I've been doing this full-time since 1997. Part-time, as basically it became a hobby that got out of control. That's how it sometimes goes, right? So I started doing research in the early 1990s, trying to understand a couple of different movements that were happening at the time. I was being really pressured to join the Masonic Lodge, and that was my starting point to try to understand that. What was the philosophical, historical, spiritual undertones that I could find as I was being asked to consider joining. I never did join, but it forced me to really dive into some big worldview questions, not just simply about Freemasonry, but about a range of topics, because I realized that there was an underlying worldview that certainly could fit in a lot of different ways with a lot of different movements. From 1997 on, I was doing this full time. I started doing research for a US-based author by the name of Gary Kaw. He had written a couple of books. I helped him write and do the editing and the research for his book, The New World Religion, back in 1998, 1999, and have been running as a freelancer ever since. So in many respects, I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I stand at the crossroads where global governance, paganism, transhumanism, transformational culture, where all of these kind of converge. And over the many years, I've attended, oh golly, scores of global governance, world federalists, UN events, transformational events. I go to Burning Man, I go to the Parliament of World Religions. This spring, I was at the Eclipse Festival in Texas, between 35 to 40,000 people coming to venerate the sun, um, hand in hand with literally just like yards away, Elon Musk's guys, NASA leaders, major tech figures. And so you had this blending of shamanism, spirituality, psychedelics, and technology all wrapped up in this one container. And then a handful of weeks before that, I was at the largest pagan gathering, indoor pagan gathering in the U.S. Midwest, Paganicon, a gathering of about 1,000 witches and Wiccans. And before that, just kind of give you a sense of the eclectic nature of the work. I was at an academic conference on the past, present, and future of NATO and restructuring NATO, what that's going to look like. So I wear a lot of different hats, and I've walked in a lot of different, kind of walked into a lot of different fields, but there are worldview correlations that are unmistakable as you start to unpack the political, the religious, the philosophical, the cultural, and the technological.
Boy, I mean that's interesting. So I'm assuming you're traveling, and you've been traveling a lot over the last 30
Yes,
plus years. You're meeting all kinds of people from multiple nations,
yes,
right, and ethnic backgrounds. Some in very high ranking kind of positions in government,
correct.
technology. I mean, this is like fascinating. I mean, not a lot of people are out there going to these things, actually. I think I would say Christians, right? Engage
No, there's a handful of us, and I pretty
a
well
handful, right?
can
Yeah.
can name them all because we all kind of know each other, and
See each other at
it's
the
right.
events. Right?
Oh, exactly. And most of us stay in contact with one another, and there's not many. When I'm saying a handful, I'm meaning, yeah, you could pretty well count them all on both hands, and you got it. Um, and there's very few of us who will do it from a range. Some of the guys will tackle primarily, let's say, the Parliament of World Religions, but then they'll maybe go to New Age festivals, psychic fairs, those type of things. Haven't really ventured into the political side. I've kind of crossed over multiple paths. So I was one of the early researchers on transhumanism. Again, I believe in the importance of actually going to where these conversations are playing out. That's super important. It's one thing to read it academically, to study the literature. It's another thing when you're at the coffee table with these guys.
Yeah, and they're saying this is what I believe and what I hope happens.
Oh, yeah, and then you get into the meat of not just their beliefs, but their hopes, their failures, their problems. You realize, yeah, and this is really important, from at least for myself. You begin to see them as people, and
Yeah,
so you have to start to differentiate. All right, what's the worldview? What is the belief system? And see also their human side, because we're created in God's image. There's value because of who made us. And as a Christian, I have to be able to bring that into play. I've got to see them as people, as souls. And that's
right.
really important.
Yeah, I think you've touched on something really important here for two reasons. First of all, we do tend to compartmentalize and demonize people as the other. That's always been an issue, and I think you're absolutely right. Our witness is as much to them as it is to the Christian community in a warning. But here's another aspect that we tend to do. When we talk about these movements, we tend to think of the movements either as monolithic or kind of instructional in a way that there's a game plan and things fall 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's not always the case. The reason why I point this out is because obviously there's been in the past people who've said, these things are coming and what have you, and it's easy to dismiss them as being so detached from the real world as to seem um, unbelievable. So, as you've done this in the past, let's talk about something that we know today is true, that maybe was hoped or predicted or was trending within these movements, say 10 or 20 years ago, and how it actually fleshed out in reality. The reason why I'm bringing this up is, one of the things you talk about with you talk about with a unifying one world a government kind of idea, right? And you've seen these movements happen in the past, and Christians wrote books about being scary Illuminati kind of things, and that didn't happen. At least it didn't happen the way it was always pictured. But let's talk about something maybe that is happening or is real now that wasn't understood 20 years ago, except by maybe some of these folks. Can you give me an example of that?
I'll give you a broad example, then a narrow example. The environmental movement. That
Yeah.
wasn't a product that arose out of a vacuum. It emerged with very specific personalities, very specific worldviews, very specific agendas, with policy concepts, ideas that ended up landing in our laps that we don't even think about it. We take it for granted. So the environmental movement is probably the most profound example that has reshaped the last 50 years. And when I'm saying 50 years, I'm serious. We're talking about policy changes following a worldview trend that already began in the early 1970s, late 1960s, with very specific individuals, very specific events. The United Nations Conference on the Human Settlements in 1972 with Maurice Strong, Wayne Kynes, and I knew both of them. I had conversations with both, who really set in motion the global environmental movement as a policy and governance agenda with an attached spiritual worldview. So that's very, very broad. Narrow that right down. My country, I'm in Canada, carbon taxes. I'm now paying a carbon tax whether I want to or not. I don't have a choice. I fill up at the pumps. I know the worldview behind it. I know the overriding perspectives, because I've literally sat in meetings at the UN going all the way back to the year 2000, where we discuss the importance of putting in carbon taxes, international transaction fees, all kinds of very specific accounting measures to pay for global environmental policy ideas. And so I fill up at the gas pumps, and I give my tithe and my offering to Gaia, Mother Earth, whether I want to or not, and it's in my face. So, I mean, Lenny, your question is really important, because sometimes we've already literally been awashed in this stuff for so long.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't recognize that there's hard realities that come with it.
So, but I mean, I remember Iron Eyes Cody and the ad campaign in the 70s, and the push against chlorofluorocarbons, and those were actually real issues, and those were things that were of real concern.
Mm-hmm.
Carbon wasn't even on the radar back then. So, are you
Right.
saying that was part of the understanding?
Oh, it was. Not at that point in time, but by, let's say, the late 1990s, early 2000s, absolutely. When I was at the United Nations Millennium Forum, one of the conversations we had was, how do we bring about some type of, well, first of all, the big question is, how do we bring about new funding to the United Nations, including some type of global taxation structure? And the recognition was carbon taxes is a prime example. If we could get the globe online with that. Canada stepped up to the plate really quick, but we were using it internally, and I'm not sure how much money we send off to the UN that way, but there's okay. So religion, broadly speaking, informs philosophy. Philosophy informs culture. It informs our social ethic. That informs politics. And so there is a cause and effect that you see playing all the way through that. You could call that matrix, or that line of thinking. And does everything come to pass the way, let's say, is being described at UN meetings? No, my goodness. I was at it was a 1 day session. This is going back again to the year 2000. I was a delegate at the United Nations Millennium Forum. I was sitting in on a working group on restructuring world order. That was literally our task, to restructure the idea of a new international arrangement, including taxation, security issues. It was really intense. We had one full session on developing a global parliament, because we do have a body of world law that has been now enacted, and these are voluntary arrangements. That's called global governance, not world government. World government is top down. Global governance is we do it voluntarily. And so we had a workshop on developing a global parliament, or a people's parliament, that would be the enforcement mechanism for world law. We have a great big room of people. And everybody wants to get, to arrive at that same mountaintop, to have this global parliament idea. And nobody can agree on how to get there. And it's infighting and arguing, and everybody has agendas, and everybody has budgets, and everybody has egos. And when it was all said and done, the whole thing had just splintered, and everybody walked away. And I'm like,
there you go. There's your
yeah,
answer.
yeah. I mean, that's the reality, right? There's still people
Yeah.
with all the fallacies that come with it.
Well,
But you don't get that unless you actually go.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of, it reminds me of C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, the gray town. Here we go. Everybody just moving further and further apart until
Yep.
we're millions and millions of miles away, in our own little egos.
Yep.
Carl, let me ask real quick, because you've been to so many of these. You mentioned environmentalism and these global conferences. I'm just wondering, are you familiar with Cal Beisner at all?
Yes. Cal and I have talked at conferences together.
Yeah, because we've had Cal on.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
And his Cornwall Alliance. And a couple of times I've spoken with him, he would talk about the spirituality that sort of guides a lot of these conferences. I remember the 2000. I was still in the Army at the time. At the time, I was at Fort Bragg, but I was an intel analyst working for the general at Fort Bragg, upper level stuff. So you just sit in a big windowless brick room and watch basically CNN and then write reports. But I was watching the 2009, I think, Copenhagen conference on climate change, and it opened up, if I recall, with what looked almost like a Protestant choir, people in long black robes with white collared shirts, singing basically hymns and chants. Of course, the hymns and chants were to the earth, right? I mean, they weren't to God. And then it, like, video streamed with children from around the world, right? Sort of pleading with Africa, Asia, America, sort of pleading with the world elders, to the politicians to save us, right? To save us from climate catastrophe, right? And restore the earth. And I'm like, man. And I remember putting it in my report. I'm like, and that's just like where it dawned on me, like, well, this is pantheism. This is the pantheistic worldview that is driving. So what I started to realize, it's not this, late 19th, early 20th century rationalist enlightenment, strict atheistic materialism anymore. The lab coated scientist, who believes that matter is impersonal and that natural forces are mechanical.
Right. Not Bertrand Russell.
Not Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayers. That's just not where we're at, and we're not even Francis Bacon, maybe. So let's get into this religious piece then that is informing the philosophy, that's informing the society, that's informing the politics. In all of these engagements, research, personal engagements, what would you say are like the most central things, the most central findings that you would want people to know about, Christians to know about, that's driving the political machine?
Okay, good question. I think one of the biggest takeaways is the realization that it offers an alternative let me back that up, an alternative messianic salvation message, that man saves himself, that we do this collectively, that we do this through our joint efforts, our politics, we do this through a worldview change, and we all have to recognize that there's no transcendent God that saves us, rather we save ourselves. That is absolutely a fundamental aspect of this. It really fits within the Romans 1 framework, where we serve and worship creation rather than the creator. And that's really foundational. That's probably one of the biggest takeaways, that we are now in a Romans 1 worldview. So we worship and serve creation, whether that's man, or it's Gaia, Mother Earth, or it is some other aspect or realm of nature, including if we take a look even into the pagan aspects, Neopaganism, Wicca, witchcraft. You see this in terms of they themselves reference their own movement as a religion of nature, that it is a worship ultimately of natural forces, the cycles of nature, the spiritual entities that they claim are behind those cycles, who are still attached to the natural process itself. So probably one of the biggest takeaways is that we are in a Romans 1 situation with an alternative salvation message being brought forth by the global community, by my national government, by your national government. Follow these prescribed ideas, follow the social narrative. You will save, by saving the earth, you save yourself, or by saving whatever the next big challenge is, you save yourself. That is so basic, but
Yeah.
it is really in your face when you start to unpack it.
Yeah, I just wrote a short book on Neopaganism, and I engaging with the Neopagan, what I call it, Neopagan scholars, people who are writing at academic level, but they're Neopagans. They're sort of defending the views, and they're trying to work out everything from ontology to ethics. There's a famous, I don't know if he's famous, but the guy that I engaged with the most, his name was Michael York. He's older now, but he wrote a couple books on he called pagan theology and pagan ethics, where he really is trying to get paganism back at the table in sort of the academic realm, to be included right there along with the theistic religions. If we're going to talk about Christianity, Islam, Judaism, well, we want paganism at the table as well. And and there's some, you're right, I would say there's, the neo-pagan will differentiate themselves because they have to, I think, also reject, I mean, certainly something like a Platonic worldview, right? The idea of anything transcendent is going to be, at least from what I've studied, is going to be dismissed for the neo-pagan. It's got to be even the older version. In the literature, it's like, this is the oldest, most original religion, right? I want to go back to that, right? Yeah. Okay. So go ahead. I mean,
Well, I love it. That is so interesting, Anthony,
yeah,
because okay,
yeah.
so I've been to Paganacon a bunch of times. It's the largest gathering of witches in the U.S. Midwest. I've been to PantheaCon, which I think no longer exists, but for like 25, 30 years, it was the biggest gathering of witches, indoor gathering in the world, and that was in.
Where are these things? Are they just, do they
Oh,
travel around
sure,
different?
sure. San
Or
Jose, California was where PantheaCon was held.
okay,
Um, Paganacon takes place in the Twin Cities region, which is probably the largest concentration of neo-pagans in the U.S. and probably worldwide, and there's reasons for it.
I just have to laugh at the self-contradictory statement of PantheaCon no longer exists. I just think that by itself is just hilarious.
well, I have heard about Paganacon because there's a section of the Twin Cities that they call, I wrote about, what's it called?
Paganistan?
Afghanistan. Yes,
Yes, yes,
I
yes,
referenced it in my book.
yes.
Afghanistan.
Murphy Pizza, who's like
Murphy Pizza. Yeah, right.
yeah,
That's
yeah. I've spent time with Murphy. She's an
oh,
interesting lady, that's for sure.
her last name just is Pizza.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right. That's interesting.
She's really a dynamic individual. She's lovely to be around. She's got a lot of life. She's got a lot of energy. She's willing to talk with you if you're respectful and willing to listen and converse back and forth. And I find a lot of these people are that way. They're willing to have conversations, and I actually think that that's a great thing. Let's have a conversation. Let's see what you really believe. Let's unpack this and compare and contrast, juxtapose now against the Christian worldview, and to see where you're coming from. But right, so this is one of the interesting takeaways of attending over the last number of years, and just listening to their internal conversations. For the longest time, it was, we are searching for our authentic past.
Yeah.
Where did we really get our rituals, our worldview from? Where's our authentic past? There's a lot of Greco-Roman reconstruction. They're not really sure what that looks like because the records is it's not as detailed as we tend to think. So where do you pull that from? We're reconstructing. We don't really know what it looked like, but we think this is what it might have been like. And so there's a lot of this Greco-Roman reconstruction. Honestly, it's a new religious movement. Wicca is a new religious movement. Gerald Gardner from the 1940s, early 1950s is the one who gave us the term, helped kind of set the stage for what Wicca looks like, modern Wicca. I was not at Paganicon in last year, 2022. My friend Don Vanneau from Midwest Christian Outreach was. He was at a workshop on the history of Druidism as an offshoot of modern paganism. And there was a box in the front of the room. And the Druid at the end of his lecture said, if you want to know all of our authentic documents, our authentic history is found in this box. Just come to the front and open it. And so Don did. And it's empty.
Empty, yeah.
And that was the point. We don't have an authentic. We are unsure. We've made these grand claims, but we really don't have a lot that we can pull out of. I mean, there's sure fragments from time periods, but nothing that is truly solid. So the conversation that, at least this is what I've observed within the Neopagan movement, is we can't lay claim to an authentic, rooted history. This is something we've been wrestling with for, well, golly, since the late 1990s for sure, probably even before that. But what we can say is your experience allows you to now have your own authentic rootedness.
Right.
It becomes internalized, experiential, an experiential spirituality. I'm like, oh man, yeah, that's a cop out.
Yeah, I mean, look, there was in the 19th century, and of course, evolution was already on the table. I don't know if you ever read Wynne Corduan's book, In the Beginning God.
No, I have
where
not.
he's talking about Wilhelm Schmidt's idea of the Urgott being an actual monotheistic God, but it's a 19th century theory that was rebutting or refuting through a certain kind of argumentation the more standard sort of view of like the Scottish and English anthropologists, that animism was the earliest form of religion,
Right.
and then it grows from
Right.
there into polytheism, and then it's not until way later with maybe Moses or maybe Akhenaten before him do you get some kind of monotheism. And Wynne
Yeah.
Corduan's book was drawing from Wilhelm Schmidt, who was this Austrian Catholic priest, writing at the same time as E.B. Tyler and these guys, who was saying, no, actually, we have evidence that monotheism was the earliest form of religion, and it sort of decayed into animism and polytheism. But I mean, it's still those are controversial debates. But
Right.
so what what they just have to say is, well, look, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they reference James Fraser a lot. I don't know. Like, I never read The Golden Bough, but
Yes,
maybe,
I've read sections of it. I've
yeah,
gotten a great big abridged version of it because, of course, there was multiple versions of the Golden
yeah,
Bough, and the Golden Bough was really an important set of early comparative religious literature with quite a few flaws, but
yeah,
nevertheless, it definitely had its impact. Same with William James, the variety of religious experience. You're looking at a very specific time period where comparative religions at that point, we're starting to become an academic field of study, and it's kind of the milieu from that late 1800s period where interestingly, the very first Parliament of World Religions takes place in 1893, which sets the tone for a new religious and political feeling that the next century, the coming century, will be the century of the common man, and that this next century would be an era of global peace and prosperity. And in their own, if you go through the speeches from the 1893 Parliament of World Religions, they're very clear. They believe that there's going to be a coming universal brotherhood of religions. We're going to have a parliament of man. All of us are going to come together. It kind of sets the tone or the milieu for the eventual League of Nations. Actually, the social gospel movement, which was burgeoning at the time, really gets some of its springboard momentum from what happened at the 1893 Parliament. The East came west. Swami Vivekananda shows up in Chicago at the Parliament, and all of a sudden you've got Krishna consciousness, you've got Vedanta philosophy. Later on, Carl Jung, Aldous Huxley, the list goes on of socialites who gravitate to the teachings that Vivekananda implanted in in Americans' religious soil at the 1893 Parliament. And so there's the end of the 1800s is really interesting because there's this mishmash, this interesting point where modernity kind of at that point begins to separate out. And while you have this hardcore Marxist materialist modernity that's coming into play, at the same time, there's this search for spirituality and there's an explosion of new religious movements. Thinking of course, what came out of New York State, out of the burned over district. And then just this washover of everything from theosophy and all kinds of new esoteric societies coming into play, and new religious movements, new pseudo-Christian cults, the JWs and Mormonism and all the rest. Right, it all kind of blows up at that point in time. It's really interesting how modernity at that point becomes, it's not just simply hardcore materialism.
Yeah, well, and our friend Owen Anderson at ASU often makes the point that Hegel was reading a lot of the Vedantas, right? I mean,
Yes,
Hegel
he was.
was consuming Eastern religion and mysticism as well. And of course, Hegel's understanding of the unfolding of the Geist, as opposed to Marx, makes a lot more room for the one world sort of spirituality. And so it's kind of and you reference Spinoza in the early chapters of the book as well, which for ontology would be obvious, right? There's one substance, it is God, so that's all there. And then also in the late 19th century, you get all the esoteric groups popping up in England and the islands. You get what it was called, the Order of the Hermetic, the Golden Order,
Golden Dawn,
and everything that then Crowley comes out of that, and then he influences Gardner. So yeah, that is an interesting spirit, that explosion of spirituality at the end of the 19th century. That's right.
and it really sets the stage for what's going to take place then in the 1960s with the countercultural movement, because it blends so much of those experiences, and then it blends art, it blends social activism, it blends political activism. And what's really remarkable, and I think we forget about this on this side of the pond, is that before America ever experienced its internal angst over the Vietnam War, France was. It was a French experience first. The French got annihilated at Dien Bien Phu, and it was a French colony, and all of a sudden it created unbelievable social unrest within the population of France, and there was protests in university protests. There was a search for the French soul, and it wasn't just from Vietnam, but Vietnam was kind of what set it all off. And then the same thing happens as your country enters that fray. And all of a sudden you got this big vacuum. Authorities no longer trusted.
So let me ask you this, because this is an important point. People will sometimes reference, say, the 1920s, right? The Roaring '20s. That was also a time where became increasingly sexually loose, considering the mores of the day, but it didn't stick. It wasn't necessarily a pivot as, say, the 1960s was. And I think the 1960s actually did fundamentally change the direction of our culture. What do you see as the destabling factor? What was missing in the 20s that was there in the 60s that really caused us to come off into a different trajectory?
Well, so the 1920s is, of course, if you would have been in the 1920s, you wouldn't have known what was going to take place in the next 15 years. But the next 15 years,
right.
You have World War II. So
yeah, the Germans, that whole 1890s, we're all going to sing "Kumbaya" together. The Germans kind of blew that thing right up.
Right, exactly. Well, and this is really fascinating because from the 1890s, we had the Hague Court that was put in place, the idea of world justice, world law, arbitration. We would all come together at a world court. This is before the League of Nations. This is even before World War One. And then World War One comes along, and I mean, World War One is the industrial slaughterhouse. 7,000 men per day for 4 years are dying on the battlefield. It is truly a remarkable industrial war, and it destroys not just simply men and equipment, but it destroys entire empires. The Ottoman Empire disappears, the Habsburgs disappear, Russia collapses, Europe is forever changed. The Middle East is forever changed.
Right.
And I, again, and this is one of those things I mean, obviously I wasn't there, you guys weren't there, but as you're going through the literature, you realize just how much of a shakeup, global shakeup World War One was. In many respects, we're still feeling the impacts of what happened in those 4 years. So then you have the 1920s. So it depends. We had the roaring 20s here, but in Germany they didn't. They had roaring inflation, and it was catastrophic. Europe was still struggling. It was still literally picking up the pieces, cleaning up the carnage. Then the 1930s, you had a technocratic mindset that was coming into play. In fact, the 1930s gave us the idea of a technical alliance, a technocratic alliance, technocracy movements. FDR's New Deal started off with Stuart Chase's 1930 book, The New Deal, which entered this idea of, hey, Russia has its revolution, its red revolution. The Germans are having their black revolution. Maybe America needs to have its technocratic dictatorship revolution, and suggested that America follow the road of national planning on every front. And it was the intellectual kind of the heartbeat of what FDR would eventually put in motion with the New Deal. And so then you have, of course, World War II that breaks out. And again, none of our cities, I mean, yeah, okay, Hawaii gets hit, but none of our cities, suffered like Dresden or like London or Tokyo. I mean, or my goodness, St. Petersburg. We walked away from it more or less unscathed compared to big swaths of the world. Yeah, it was hard for the world, no doubt. But all of this it's remarkable because war plays such a monumental role then in beginning to shift the patterns of thinking. So by the 1960s, if I grew up in the 70s, I was born in 68, so I'm just I was just a little guy in the late 1960s, just a toddler. But as I've had conversations and going through the literature, it's something hit me. If I would have been a young person of fighting age, maybe going to college in the 1960s, my grandfather would have fought in World War One. My dad would have fought in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
My uncle or older brother would have fought in Korea.
Yeah.
And so the weight of the last 50 years would have been on my shoulders. And I view the Vietnam era, that era for first France and then America, and I bring it out in the book, I view that as a pivotal time when especially American youth, were ripe to say, we're done. We're done with this.
Right. No, yeah.
And modernity gave us Auschwitz. It gave us the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
It gave us the industrial killing field. We're done now with materialism, but we're also done with Christianity. We're done with that old square way of thinking.
Christian name, right?
Right.
Christian name.
Throw it all out.
Yeah. So what do we got left? Well, we enter postmodernism.
I'll say this, and because this is, about maybe 8 years ago now, before George Floyd, before all the social justice stuff really exploded on the scene. I started reading the critical theorists, especially the Frankfurt School guys. Now, of course, what is motivating them is they want to prevent authoritarian dictatorship governments, right? That's certainly part of what's motivating them. They had all fled to some degree or another from Germany, from Frankfurt. This is Marcuse, Horkheimer, Adorno. Of course, they're drawn from Walter Benjamin and I forget the Hungarian guy's name right now, Lukács. And they're all Jewish, and they've fled. They're in New York now, and then later out here in California. and they're, of course, they're Marxists. They're neo-Marxists. They're going to work through culture, but they're doing something similar as well. They're criticizing, of course, at a more intellectual level, the whole Enlightenment project, right? Instrumental reason, science, these things just are not going to get us to where we want to be as a society. So they developed their social philosophy, right? And where I actually started to realize this sort of paganism that is can emerge out of the project of critical theory is I was reading some journal articles in some critical legal studies journals from the 90s. The Minnesota, in fact, the Minnesota Journal of Law, and there was an article in there by a critical legal scholar, critical race theorist by the name of Kenneth Nunn, where he levies this criticism against white European thinking, ways of thinking, almost like cognitive features that Europeans have. And then he just sort of claims without any evidence that other cultures don't have these features. Or there's this toxic mix of, and he goes to like hyper rationalism, abstraction, objective thinking. And then he gets down to this seventh feature of European thought called desacralization. And this is a big word in the literature, in critical theory literature, that if Europeans believe in a God, it's this distant, sort of abstract God of the philosophers. It's not the God that pervades the world. It's like that, the desacralization. Now, some people might think, as Christians, might sit there and like, oh yeah, well, we're for sort of a sacredness to nature. But what he's talking about here is very technical. He's talking about what the Bible talks about, which is a desacralization process. The Old Testament is very clear about this, that the processes of nature, this is what Genesis 1:1 is all about. The processes of nature are not imbued with their own innate power. They are contingent and derivative. That power is given by God, who's transcendent. And I'm like, this wasn't the Frankfurt School per se, but it gets there. And I'm like, wow, this opens the door up for pantheistic and pagan kind of thinking to undergird your institutions, right? Because this isn't a legal journal. And then you wonder, and then, several years after this, you see like Black Lives Matter in our own country, but it's a global movement. And who are the founders of Black Lives Matter? They're all practicing animists.
Yes.
Three of them,
Yeah.
Garza, Colors, and Omedi, are all animists. They're not Martin Luther King Jr., son of a Baptist minister who named himself
Right.
after Martin Luther. They're practicing animists, and all these Christian churches and seminary people, they're all getting on board with it. And I'm like, have you guys looked at like who runs this show? But anyway, so I went on.
I think it's interesting that one of the most common epithets against early Christians by the Romans were that they were atheists. That's
Right.
what they were called.
Yeah.
You're atheist because you don't believe in all the gods. You don't build temples to your gods. Where's the image of your God? And that was their primary charge that they would use to attack and crucify Christians, that they're atheists.
Absolutely. Yes. And so by the time, so the late 1960s, you have this incredible social tension. Postmodernism, in essence, enters the stage. And of course, postmodernism goes far back beyond that. But that's when we can look at a beginning point of sorts, where the masses begin to adopt that line of thinking.
Kind of ascendancy of the idea of postmodernism.
That's right. But at the same time, what does postmodernism really give us? It gives us a vacuum of meaning. It doesn't give us a real direction. It doesn't give us purpose. And so by the time the late 1960s comes along, early 1970s, there is something already taking its place in a way. And it was already evident. So I'm going to hold up a book. And this is the book that in many respects kickstarts so much of this generation, my generation's new thinking. And that is the Environmental Handbook. So the Environmental Handbook was prepared for the first national teach-in on the environment, April the 22nd, 1970. It's the very first Earth Day. Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin, has traveled around the country trying to arouse interest in stewardship and conservation issues. And this was, even before, this is like 66, 67, he was traveling around, really wasn't getting pulled together the way he was envisioning it. And then he realized that if he wanted to capture the American mind, the best thing to do was emulate the anti-war movement with its national sit-ins. And so he created the National Teach-In on the environment. Friends of Earth came along and said, hey, we're going to help put a book forward called the Environmental Handbook, and it'll set the tone, it'll set the stage for what the next generation should do and think in terms of environmental, the new environmental worldview. So I'm not going to, if you had the opportunity to grab a copy, go for it. It's remarkable. Roughly 20 million Americans participated in the very first Earth Day. It opens up with a Smokey the Bear Sutra, where Smokey the Bear becomes a mystical figure and comes and destroys capitalism and wipes out using Hindu cosmology, wipes out the capitalist West. Lovely for Smokey the Bear. And then the first major essay was Lynn White Jr.'s famous essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, saying that we need a new religion and we're done with the Judeo-Christian worldview. Literally saying we need to find a new religion. Towards the end of the book, you have a long list of enlightened. It seems evident that there are throughout the world certain social and religious forces which have worked through history toward an ecologically and culturally enlightened state of affairs. Let these be encouraged. Gnostics, hip Marxists, Teilhard de Chardin Catholics, Druids, Taoists, goes on, Zens, shamans, alchemists. Here you go. And it's crazy. It's making suggestions. Hey, we're overpopulated. Back to the attack on Genesis. We're overpopulated. You can't have any more than 2 children. Ladies, we need polyandrous marriages. One woman, multiple men. We need group marriages.
Yeah. So that's in Marcuse big time too. Marcuse's Eros and Civilization is all about return to the polymorphous perverse state that Freud talked about. Because and literally in that book, he argues that if we were to return back to our original nature, where prior to the dawn of rationality and self-awareness, where we were just sort of like pleasure-seeking sensory creatures, that this would totally change our entire nature. We would experience time differently, he says. It's incredible.
Yes.
So, and what struck me too, and I don't know if Lynn White or any of these guys were themselves ethnically Jewish, but all the Frankfurt School guys were ethnically Jewish. They grew up, I'm sure, in Germany, learning the Torah, learning scripture, even if they rejected it. But it goes back to the curse of Genesis 3, the 3 curses on man, on woman, and on the earth. And I'm like, and it's right on the back of your book. Man has 3 goals, right? And you said to be as God, to be masters of the universe, and to build heaven on earth. And it's like, well, this is what we're doing. We're trying to overturn the curses.
Yes.
In our own strength,
100%.
Reference to nature's God.
Right.
Yeah.
100%.
Perfect 1970 Environmentalist Handbook. There it is.
And of course, this was actually given out to school children. That's who this was aimed towards. And I can't remember the numbers. I think something to the effect of 10,000 elementary schools. This was actually one of the textbooks in my own high school, out in the middle of nowhere, prairies, rural Canada.
Wow.
I think it's an important thing also to as we talk about this, to see that there is a serious distinction between now and, say, previous eras. I've heard a lot of people say, well, we're back to a pagan culture, right? And just like the first century church had to come in and penetrate the pagan culture, so we do as well. That's possibly true to an extent, but we are not in a pagan culture. We're in a post-Christian pagan culture.
Yes.
So it's not that Christianity is this new thing that is possibly intriguing or somewhat different. It's considered now old hat. And that positions us in a much different context than the early church did. We aren't going to be attractive because, wow, look at how different they are. And I don't know anything about them. Let me find out. Everybody's going to say, oh, we know about them. Even if they're wrong, they just assume it and dismiss it. I think that's a big issue that we have to think through. Now,
Absolutely agree, Lenny.
Let me ask,
what you just said is so important that way. You're right.
Let me ask you one other question, because you had talked about how war has traditionally reshaped world events and world cultures to a dramatic level. And of course, we've been in a fairly prolonged period of relative peace. There are factions and skirmishes that are going on, but they don't rock the world the way even the 100 Years' War did. However, I would say that our last experience, that global pandemic, was something that possibly could be equally world shaping, because I have never seen so many cultures do the same thing in the same way with the same moral certainty and top-down governance that I saw from 2020 to 2022. It literally took my breath away, and it made me think that this is one of those other pivot moments in world history. And what fear I have is that this idea of safetyism, that we outsource the decisions of our better selves for just this kind of generic safety kind of existence, has such a grip on us now that we've lost quite a bit of what animates us as a nation generally, or as nations particularly. So could you comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. You're right. It was a watershed moment. It was when we said yes to the bureaucratic state, yes to the rule by experts, and it wasn't just simply having that conversation with you and your doctor, who should be your expert, in terms of having that relationship where your doctor knows who you are, you know who he is, he knows your chart, he knows what's best, he knows your medical conditions. No, it was a blanket to dictate of sorts, where we had national, and then you folks like us, we had provincial and state level bureaucrats, state authorities giving us the directives of what we should do. And it was like this around the world. And you saw nation after nation really following the recommendations of Neil Ferguson out of the UK, working with the World Health Organization, but Neil Ferguson specifically, because he really set a lot of the numbers in play as a statistician, saying, hey, if you do lockdowns, if you do all this, you're going to bring down your death levels to a certain point. But if you don't, your death levels are going to be elevated, and it's going to be out of control, and we're going to have a worldwide catastrophe of an even greater magnitude. It's going to be like super catastrophic. And Ferguson's methodology and his statistic work has in the past been questioned. It's actually failed on a number of fronts, but we bought it. Bought it, and we all absorbed it, and it became a global policy.
I didn't absorb it.
Well, here's something else. Here's something else that I've been thinking about, and I've not seen anybody talk about this. Before 10 years before this, there was a very popular book that came out by John M. Barry on the Spanish flu, the great influenza. Everybody read this book. And Bush's cabinet, George W. Bush's cabinet, read this book, and they brought it to him, and they said, we need to prepare for this because this will happen. It has to happen. It tends to happen every century or so. So we're due, kind of that kind of thing. And I really think that if Barry's book hadn't been there, our reaction would be vastly different. But I've not seen anyone put these threads together. How many of the folks in higher positions of power read that book and reacted by saying, oh my gosh, it's here again. And we're going to follow, ignoring again the advances in medical knowledge and understanding of germ theory and all of that, ignoring all of that, just thinking the dominoes are going to fall unless we as the experts react.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good question. It would be interesting to know who all read that book, and what type of an influence that book was. That would actually would be really fascinating, because you're right. It was a very, very well read book for the time, um, and interesting parallels.
Yeah, I know Bush's cabinet specifically
Yeah,
read it and said we need to prepare for it. I know that
fa-
that's true.
fascinating. That is
I want to make
fascinating.
I want to make a point off of this and then segue into one other another important question I have for you, Carl. I think one of the reasons why you can have this sort of lockdown, global lockdown, and most people at least acquiesce that maybe you couldn't have done this maybe even a generation ago, is because of technology.
Right.
Right? Because most of us, at least in the West, we can sit and we can have Zoom conversations if we need to talk to somebody. We have video games we can play. We got the weapons of mass distraction, as Os Guinness, I think, coined the term, where, I mean, 30 or 40 years ago, if you had been locked up in your house, you literally would have gone crazy because you didn't have those kinds of things to sort of entertain you, keep your mind somewhat engaged. I mean, maybe people would have read more books and listened to more classical music, and that would be a better thing to do. But we have so many more means, I mean, but the means of communication, not just talking to somebody on telephone, but actually seeing them, I think gave us a sense of, oh, I don't need to go outside because tech, we're getting more tech, like addicted anyways,
Right.
right? I mean,
Dependent. Certainly
yeah,
dependent.
we're so dependent. Me too. I mean, I'm guilty as charged. Like I can sit in front of this darn computer. We're doing it right now. So what's the difference if I'm locked down or not? I'm already sitting at home 10, 12 hours a day on my computer, surfing the net, looking at YouTube videos. Maybe I'm doing productive things like writing an article or reading an ebook. But so I think let's segue to the technology piece, because in a lot of the things you're going to, it's not just neo-pagans back to nature.
No,
It's it's
it's more.
it's high tech. We've mentioned the technocratic movement of the 40s and 50s, and I was there was an Arnold Toynbee gave a speech like 1950 something at UCLA, and I was listening to it, and he's also kind of developed this sort of, we all need to come together with the technology we have, but this tech piece, we got to talk about this, the transhumanist and the tech piece. Like, so I'll just let you go with that. What have you seen there? I
Well,
want to just be like, let go, give us the fire hose on
oh my
this.
goodness, a fire hose. It's a big fire hose. But
Yeah,
let me quickly say something, though, going back to COVID, because you made a really interesting point about we're sitting on our Zoom calls, we're doing all of our, as if we can build and develop everything on with a platform, a virtual platform.
right.
And I have to remind everybody that really what we saw was a distinction, or a conflict between the laptop class, and let's call them the builder class.
Yeah,
Those who can just sit at home and work at home on their laptop, and then the rest of the people who've got they've got to get in their trucks. They've got to get their hammers out. They got to go. And I come from a farming background. I'm a farm boy, and I live in a rural area. And for the most part, I mean, we're not the laptop class,
Yeah,
and it was a laptop class that put the lockdowns on us,
yeah,
and
yeah.
said,
And
"Hey,
work for education.
right, exactly." And it was like, "Hey, everybody's going to take a hit." Well, the laptop class didn't really take the hit, but the guys who worked with their hands took the hit hard.
yeah.
You
Truckers.
know, so yeah, exactly. Lenny, you're going to say something.
Well, I just even today there are in talks of depressed marriage rates and things like that. Most young people will say that they don't know, or young men don't know how to approach a woman, say in person,
Right.
and they feel that it's almost wrong or dangerous rather than to do it online first. So this is where we're at today.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
disembodiedness.
Yes, it's weird, isn't it?
I would
Like,
say, I just got to mention this. E.M. Forrester, who was no Christian, I think the book is 1909. He wrote a short story called "The Machine Stops." People can read that. I mean, there's some things in there you're like, how did this guy foresee what was coming up 100 years in advance? Anyway, okay, so yeah. So what have you seen then tech in this synthesis of tech and pagan spirituality at these conferences? Who are the players? Yeah.
So I'll give you a term. Pardon me. And I heard it again at the Eclipse Festival just a few weeks back,
Okay.
that we are entering an ancient future worldview. And that is the language that's being thrown around. This is an ancient future worldview. We incorporate the ancient pagan ideals. We incorporate the worship of nature, the expression of our service to the earth, now with technology, with digitization. We merge the two together, and this will give us a new worldview. And not just simply a new worldview, it will give us now the tools to be able to bring that worldview into play. This is 2018. I was at Burning Man at a workshop on psychedelics and spirituality. And I'm not going to give the gentleman's name, but he was a leading figure in the world of cryptocurrency. And he had just come back from doing whatever, like a 3 or 4 day ayahuasca journey. He got to Burning Man and he gave us this big tech talk. And there was, I think, like maybe 50 people, 30, 40, 50 people or something like this in this tent, this zone. And over the space of roughly 2 hours, he laid kind of a roadmap out for us in our conversation. And he put it this way, and this fits with that ancient future worldview idea. And he said, what we need are, and essentially, I'm just giving you the Coles notes, we need 4 new building blocks. The first building block is a new spiritual reality, out with the Judeo-Christian idea that God is other, distinct, and separate, in with a shamanistic, psychedelic, divine feminine, mystical, experiential-based spirituality. This is number one, the most important thing on the list. Have a new sense of spirituality. Then number 2, we need a new social ethic that comes with it, a new social contract that comes with that. And as he explained it, that's being played out in real time at Burning Man. And it is. We were experimenting with new systems of governance, new ways of doing community, new relationships, new sexual relationships. It's all being played out in real time at Burning Man. And then what we need, and this is how he described it, we need a new governance economic model. We need to be able to have your purchasing behaviors predicated on blocks 1 and 2. How do you do that? How do you now monitor all of this at a global level? Artificial intelligence becomes the tool to ensure that your buying patterns, your purchasing patterns, reflects that you are indeed part of this new civilization, having this new global ethic, this new social contract, having a new spirituality. So if all of a sudden, let's say you're buying products that no longer represents this, or you're not purchasing your carbon offsets, maybe you'll get penalized. Maybe you'll have points taken away. However that would get framed out. But it was fascinating because I walked out of there with my jaw on the ground going, well, this is re-enchantment. This is that ancient future worldview where both are being blended. The mythological pagan past with this new future utopian technological heaven on earth. And it was really remarkable.
It's really interesting how it kind of reminds me how people want to claim an ancient heritage, but understand that practically they can't do so because in order to be consistent and live in that worldview, then they lose the very tools that they can use to leverage their belief and foist it upon others. It's a matter of fact, there was a neo-Luddite movement that showed up in the early 1990s, and they had a website. And you're going, but this is really an interesting.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lenny. Finish your thought.
It's just a really interesting. I don't think that they're actually buying into I think they use the ancient language as cover, much the same way that the LDS Church says, well, we're Christians too, but you're all apostate. You're all right. They're all anathema is what the first vision supposedly reports. And it's the same ploy.
Speaking of LDS, Carl, I think maybe a week or two ago I put on Facebook like we'll be interviewing Carl Teichrib on his book, and there's this guy on Facebook that I go back and forth with a little bit. He's a Mormon, he's LDS, and he said, "Oh, I was just at the LDS, the Mormon conference on transhumanism,
Oh
like
yeah.
week or something," and I'm like, "What?" And then
Oh yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. In fact, I was a speaker at the Mormon Transhumanist Association back in 2013.
maybe that's
Um,
what it was. I saw that. I don't know if that was in the book or I saw that somewhere on your site, and then I read
yeah.
it, and I said,
Yes.
"Oh yeah, I was just there."
Yeah. Yeah. No. That's a really interesting organization. I've met some really nice people through it. I would say that I've got a couple of friendships that have, I mean, they're distant friendships. We don't get together very often. It's been actually a number of years now since I've really had a chance to sit and face to face with especially Lincoln Cannon, the founder of it. We completely disagree on our worldview. We hold very, very different perspectives, but I give them credit for bringing me on back in 2013 to come as a Christian critic on religious transhumanism.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm not the first, but I'm one of the early Christian critics of transhumanism. And I specifically would be going to transhumanist events to try to understand, all right, what is this movement? How is it going to impact and shape the world? It's an intellectual movement, first and foremost. It's very decentralized in the sense that there isn't an overarching, like a United Nations of transhumanism,
Right.
though ironically that was attempted in 2013. In fact, here's the Global Futures 2045 agenda, when in 2013 we had like the rock stars of the transhumanist movement, 800 of them, come together in New York City, put a letter forward to the United Nations and saying we need some global management. We need transhumanism to be globally, internationally managed, collectivized. Um, and it was headed up by Dmitry Itskov, a Russian tech entrepreneur. And he writes it this way. This is what he puts in in the opening of the agenda book. Um, oh, golly, here we go. I am certain that if we want to continue to develop and change civilization for the better, we should resolve this evolutionary dilemma and create a new evolutionary strategy, taking us to a society based on the 5 principles of high spirituality, high culture, high ethics, high science, and high technology. And there was no end to the talk of spirituality at the
Yeah.
Global Futures event. In fact, it closed off with an interfaith panel. Christian, some Hindu,
Right.
rabbi. I can't remember all the different religious leaders that were there, talking about how through transhumanism we will discover that you are the way, you are the truth, you are the
You know,
life.
okay. I want to get onto something here next, but you must be from. Are you? I think you'll probably be familiar with Paul Kingsnorth and some of the
Yes.
things that he's written. I mean, he wrote an article for Touchdown called "AI Demonic," and some of the things that you were talking about really reminded me of that article. I don't know that I agree with everything in there, but he's laying out again a lot about this ancient what did he call it? The ancient futurist, the ancient future religious view, and that's some boy. I really want people in the church to. I just think this is the most important thing we could be dealing with right now. And what I also want to emphasize that is so important about what you've been doing is going to these conferences again and talking with the people and getting to know them and having friendships and conversations with them. Because one of my concerns is that there's not like you can't do like classical or traditional apologetics here. It's not like you're gonna. I mean, you could maybe you say like, oh, natural theology and arguments for the existence of God and reliability of Scripture. I don't know that that's really going to resonate with people who are in this movement or moving in this direction. You need to. You can't be exchanging journal articles or abstract argumentation. You need to get in. We need to get in there and talk with people. And
Yes.
this is spiritual. These are spiritual encounters, right? It's the
Right.
Holy Spirit or other spirits that are involved here if we're taking the Bible seriously. And this is where I'm going with the next question. And that is going to require face-to-face evangelism, talking with people, think, about their worldview, about what the Bible says, and so on and so forth. On that note, then, of the spiritual nature of these things, and because you've been in there, you've been to Burning Man several times now, I think, right?
Yes, yeah. I got my ticket. I'll, unless I got some type of huge emergency, I'll be back at it again this fall.
Yeah, and I've thought about going there on one of these evangelist trips, but I got saved at 34, and I wouldn't say that I was deeply into paganism before that, but I had my brushes with spirituality and things, and but so there's a reality there. I mean, when you get in there, there's a reality that you're going to confront and experience of it, a deeply spiritual nature. So I know you reference Michael S. Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, a few times in your book, but what would you say from a biblical perspective? What do you think we are up against? Not just at the level of worldview, but really at the level of the spirits. I mean, let's talk about the encounters when the veil is lifted at the end of the day. Do we think that the pagan gods are real? Do we think that they're remanifesting themselves through these movements? I mean, what's your perspective from a biblical worldview? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I'm just trying to think of maybe the best way of how I bring this out. I think the most important thing to realize is that it's not necessarily about the personality of that demonic or spiritual entity, that fallen angel entity, but the doctrines that come forth through it. Literally, the doctrine of demon that we see laid out. What are those doctrines? What are those teachings? I'm not expecting to see a manifestation. I would claim my first demonic encounter last year at a regional Burning Man event last summer. I've been in this space for a long, long time. I have lots of people ask these questions. Have you ever, do you feel the spiritual darkness? Do you feel? No. Can you find me any place in Scripture where it talks about how I feel spiritual beings or how I feel the darkness? You don't find that kind of language. That's something that we have incorporated, especially in the last 30 years since the satanic scare of the 1980s, when we've now adopted more of a Hollywood version of spiritual warfare than a biblical version of spiritual warfare, which is tearing down arguments, strongholds of thought, beliefs, philosophies, doctrines, including those doctrines of demons, which are teaching or preaching a worldview, a biblical, that's antithetical to the biblical worldview. And so, I mean, like I said, I've had my first encounter last year. It took me off guard. I've been in some other pretty freaky situations, and even at Burning Man, yeah, it's intense. It's absolutely intense. There's lots of things happening, and I've had a lot of people say, "Well, how can you go there?" And my response is really simple: How can you go to Walmart? How can you go to McDonald's? It's all around us. It's completely, it's infused in the culture. All these are is a concentration. It's a place where it's being fleshed out, where it's being discussed, lived out, practiced for a short period of time. That's it.
Yeah, no, that's a super good point. Because I've, and I would say that now I have had encounters before and after my conversion where I would say, and I'm not disagreeing with you per se, but where the encounters were pretty intense, that there was a spiritual entity. Now, what I do want to distinguish, and I think this you're doing, I'm not talking about like possession. Like Roman Catholic Church has a very strict kind of criteria for talking about actual possession. And it's the 1% of the 1% of the 1%. I think that's the right way. But there's something more like the demonic that can be on display, even though you're not dealing directly with somebody who's demonically possessed. It's the whole apparatus that's kind of built up. And so I don't want people to go around thinking there's a demon under every dustpan or anything like that, which is, I think, important if we are coming back into a re-enchanted world.
Absolutely.
You don't want to a good friend of mine who's been writing several books now on a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation, critical of it. But we've been talking about this because we're coming into this re-enchanted world. The disenchantment of that Weber talked about, it's over, right? But one of the things where we would want to be careful about if re-enchantment is more and more just the world we're living in again, is to not see demons everywhere either.
Right. Really important.
Yeah. So that's but I agree with you. I walk into Walmart these days and I don't feel afraid, but I'm like, I look around and I'm just like, sometimes I'm just saddened, especially when my children, boys,
yes. And there's
people don't look human anymore. Some people really don't look.
Well, I know. So we've entered a cultural time period where it's now becoming more and more publicly displayed the physical outpourings or expressions of already the inward worldview, the inward doctrines that have been accepted. So I'm not surprised when you walk into the mall and you're like, oh wow, this is different. This is not the 1970s, the 1980s, or even the 1990s. It's radically changed.
Yeah, sensory.
Yes, absolutely.
Which, in the Christian, and this is one thing I read about in the book, in the Christian tradition, the way to approach God is through asceticism, right? The denial. I mean, think of the Desert Fathers going out into the wilderness, you get away from the Jacques Ellul. I don't know if you read him.
Yes, I have. Yep.
Of the city, and then technical, for us, it's like, it's the restraint on the senses, right, is sort of the more mystical route. It's the asceticism. Now that can get taken to obviously extreme. Talks about
completely.
Right. So I'm not
right.
There is a sense of like the pagan world is hyper sensory. It's hyper, and you start off the book like you walk into this world of just. You were at one event in Texas, I think somewhere. It was just the hypersensitive, the sounds and the sights and everything. And in a sense,
that's Burning Man. That's Burning Man is sensory overload completely, totally, and it's psychologically powerful. Yes,
that you're not overloaded anymore, which is
right.
I don't know, but yeah. Okay.
Well,
all right. So.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with Pitikrim Sorokin, who is a Harvard sociologist who talks about how cultures seem to swing between what he calls an ideational culture and a sensate culture. And he notes how a lot of these trends happen over several decades or even centuries, where we come out of this ideational culture, which would be the rationalism, the modernism, into a more sensate feeling culture. And that's the thing that drives us. And he hooks several, like the downfall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire moved from an ideational to a sensate culture and things of that nature. And it's kind of what we're seeing in our society as well. When we lose the primary story of thought and start going with feeling, all the threads start to unravel. And I think it's fascinating to see that the scriptures talk about the ideas as the central focus of the battle in the worldviews with individuals, while the prayer becomes the way that we disarm the powers and the principalities and powers behind them.
Right. And part of the disarming is to be truth tellers, to bring forward the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because if he is truly the way, the truth, and the life, if he's the one who defeated death by conquering the grave, nobody else has done that. I mean, there's a uniqueness there that is unparalleled in all of the history of the universe. We have a uniqueness in Jesus Christ. So back to kind of the starting point of your question, how do we, and because it was implied in there, how do we now respond? How do we bring this forward? How do we have these conversations? So all I can give you is just some examples, and they're biblical examples as well, of how we've tried to approach bringing forward the gospel of Jesus Christ into this culture. First of all, we listen to them. We listen to what they're saying, and we treat them with respect. We treat them as human beings. Really important. We recognize that every single person that we're going to be encountering will have a unique life circumstance, a unique set of pains, heartache, whatever. Well, hey, listen, when you go to Burning Man, the thing that's probably the most powerful of all your experiences at Burning Man won't be the lights, it won't be the sounds, it won't be the sexuality, the nudity, it won't even be the man, the big effigy of the man. It's the temple. This huge construction. And in 2018, it was a great big spiral shape that rose up into the sky, 65 feet high, 250 feet wide. And by the end of the week, it starts off, first of all, as a blank slate. All the walls are clean and bare. By the end of the week, it is mounded with mementos, wedding dresses, urns of ashes of loved ones, photo albums, private journals. Thousands, tens of thousands of messages have been scrawled across the face of the structure, internally and externally. Last year's temple, the Temple of the Heart, was a remarkable structure. It was roughly a $500,000. That's what it cost to build this thing. That did not include the donations of material, time, transport. Just $15,000. I talked to the lead builder. $15,000 was spent in bottled water just to keep everybody hydrated as they built this enormous structure. And then all week long, it becomes a funeral for 24 hours, for 9 days long, as people are pouring out their grief.
Yeah.
And when you're there, you have a lump in your throat. There's a human experience that's taking place.
Right.
There's hurt, there's pain, there's grief, there's hopes. All of this stuff is on full display. And what strikes you is we're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with human beings. And every one of these people who are writing a note, leaving a memento, some token, some expression of the grief has gone through something hard.
Yeah.
And so we have to approach them with that respect, with that understanding. They're not a target. They're
Yeah.
They're a person.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, how do you have these conversations? Well, at Burning Man, we set up a sign. We have the name of our camp is called the Camp of the Unknown God, based out of Acts 17.
Wow.
So, and that right there elicits conversations. People ask, we've literally had this blurted out. Who is this unknown God? Well, hey, come on in. Here's some water. Here's some food. Get in under the shade. Tell us your story first before we get back to this. But we will get back to it. But we want to know who you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then now we're investing in each other's lives.
Yeah.
We've had other situations, and not just at Burning Man, at Parliament World Religions and in other places. And I'm not going primarily to doing outreach. I'm there as a researcher. Some of my team is there primarily for outreach. I'm there doing both. I'm wearing a number of hats, actually. But it's interesting because we end up going back to something as basic as, is reality one or two?
Right.
Is it oneism, God, man, and nature, all essentially connected, all interlinked, all sharing the same essence?
Right.
Or is it two, God, distinct, and other, and then everything else? Back to that Romans 1 situation. Which way do we go? A number of years ago when I was at Paganicon, I think this is like in 2019, I had some guy hit on me because it's also a sexual world.
Right.
And diffused the advance, and then said, let's have coffee. Let's sit down and have coffee. Because, yeah, he's still a human being, right? So we sat down. We had this great big conversation. He asked what kind of pagan I was. And I'm like, well, I'm not a pagan. Sorry, buddy. I'm a Christian. And he's like,
look like one, but
yeah, it's the beard. Yeah. and he's like, what are you doing here? And that opened up this huge conversation. We dived into oneism versus twoism.
Right.
Just
technical for people is the monism,
right?
Ontological monism. Would say like pantheism and the Spinoza idea of there's only one substance; it's all divine. And you're
that's right. Yes. And then last year at Burning Man, my friend Brian, who he does blacksmithing as a hobby, he made these these crosses, and he's just handing them out and giving them to people. Last year we had, of course, the place got rained out. It all was mud. CNN was flying their helicopters, and MSNBC and all the media was, checking out what was happening down below, and nobody could leave. It was a big mud fest. And on Monday night, because they had to burn the man later instead of Saturday like they normally do, Monday night they burned the man, and then at midnight they burned the Chapel of Babel, a 65-foot tall Tower of Babel, and it was called the Chapel of Babel. And I mean, it was very in your face. And so at midnight, we're watching this thing burn. And Brian, who's super tired, I mean, we've been there for whatever now, 10 days or something. He's got this girl sitting beside him, this young lady, and she's pestering him. She wants to have a conversation. Brian's not interested in talking. He's tired. Kind of leave me alone, leave me alone. Finally, they end up having this conversation, and she talks about being on a journey, yada, yada, yada. And Brian wasn't getting the cue. But it hit when Brian gave her a cross. He stopped at the end and said, here's a cross. And he explained how he makes this cross as a blacksmith. And he just simply said, trust Jesus. And as he gives it to her, she breaks. She breaks. Her eyes are locked with Brian's eyes for like an uncomfortably long period of time. And the tears are pouring down her face. And she is just locked onto Brian's eyes. And she turns to Brian's wife, Audrey. Same thing. Tears are streaming, locking eye-to-eye contact for a long time. She turns to me. She grabs my arm. I hold her shoulder, and she's just weeping. We don't know what the story was. She got up and she left. And it, it was an awkward moment, but something happened. We don't know her backstory. We don't know what she came out of. We don't know her journey. We didn't get that cue. We missed that cue.
Well,
but that's something that simple blew her away, and it blew us away.
This is something. This is again why I wanted to have another reason why I have you on, because I mean, Lenny and I have been in the apologetics community for a while. Lenny for a long while, me more recently, and I'm trying to at least tell people, look, because here's the thing, I think, with the person who's on the spiritual journey, the spiritualist, the Neopagan, the pagan, the Wiccan, they don't necessarily have all these rational defenses up.
No,
the way the online atheist has, Richard Dawkins.
No.
They are interested. They're looking, and they wouldn't be there. They probably wouldn't be there if something hadn't happened significantly, and not an intellectual thing per se. I mean, maybe there's some. Well, I didn't find the arguments for God, compelling. But maybe you'll see that. I don't know. You could speak to that, but when you get to people who they're already there as far as like looking for the meaning, the purpose of life beyond, they've rejected in a sense. Dawkins is, the universe is just blind, pitiless indifference, and this is what we'd expect if they're, they've rejected that in a sense already, right? Implicitly or explicitly, they rejected that. So the encounter with that needs to come through the church, that needs to come through the representatives of the body of Christ. The encounter that has to happen, it's not in the abstract. It's not going to be through the journal, the exchange. I mean, maybe it will if paganism starts to, I have been reading a lot of this Michael York, and, he's got some interesting books out there, and he's a scholar. He's an academic. I think he was at Cambridge or something. And so maybe there's engagements there that you have to make as well at the more intellectual level. But I really think this is where there needs to be more exposure and a shift in our concrete engagement with people, because more and more people are out there. They're looking, and this could be a Burning Man, or it could be a Walmart. Could be a Walmart that we got it right.
Absolutely. We tend to forget.
The tattoos themselves will tell you.
Right.
If you can see what the person's tattooed up with.
Yes.
It's not John 3:16 or whatever. That might give you a tip. Look at their tattoos. I see a lot of people, they'll have tattoos of their ancestors or of explicit more pagan. I think we're in a lot of Hispanics here. They'll have more like Aztec imagery or something. and those can be conversation starters. Hey, what's that
Absolutely.
about? Why is it important to you, right?
Right,
So,
right.
yeah, that's good.
Absolutely. We tend to forget that wherever our feet is, that's where our ministry is.
Yeah, amen to
Yeah,
that.
honestly, because it really is. So, I mean, a couple of quick points here. First of all, at least not necessarily in the Burning Man community, there's parallels, there's overlaps, but in the Wiccan community, I would say the majority of people have come out of a Christian background.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, that's something that
There's
when you
more of
rub
an
shoulders,
explicit kind of distance.
oh,
Yeah.
huge amount of them come out of a church background. In fact, you could
You know,
argue that probably a majority.
that's
Okay.
interesting. I write for an online magazine called Patheos. I've been writing for them for 3 years. It's a big all things religion site. One of them is New Age and paganism, and a lot of the writers there are former Christians.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
that is a very that's something the church needs to wrestle with. I can give you some reasons why they're there because they've told me, but that's something that the church needs to wrestle with. The other thing that is interesting is when I'm at Burning Man, or at least especially at the regional burns, I've been doing surveys, and then last year I did surveys at Burning Man itself. It's hard to do surveys at Burning Man because everybody's racing to go to see the next shiny thing, you know. Um, but I was at the man doing these surveys, and on my survey, I have a list of your past and your present religion or philosophical position from atheism, and roughly 20, there's 20 categories plus other. And it's interesting. So often it's past Christian, past Christian, past Christian, now Wiccan, now atheist, now agnostic, now Buddhist. But then as you go through my survey, and it's a 2-page survey, there's a series of statements. One of the statements is the earth is fundamentally alive. And you can choose to say disagree, strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, neutral, somewhat agree, strongly agree. What's interesting is everybody who puts down atheist says that the earth is fundamentally alive. So I'm like, so while you've rejected the Christian God, you have said yes to mythology, even as an atheist. So I think that would, at least for myself, that was a fascinating takeaway. It's like, okay, um, I'm not even going to talk to you at your atheistic level. Let's talk now at something more fundamentally spiritual, because you've already indicated that you've swung from a hardcore materialist. You're still an atheist when it comes to the Christian God, but you're not a hardcore materialist anymore.
Not a hardcore man. You're not a blind person. This is one of the things I've been suggesting to some of the guys who do philosophy of religion is maybe even to get away from talking about, physicalism or materialism versus immaterialism or spiritualism, and talking about what do you think is most the fundamental reality personal or impersonal?
Hmm. Yeah.
Right, because I think
Yep.
a lot, if you could put the question that way, and I bet a lot of these people say the atheists would still say reality is personal. It's like a person, right? They wouldn't say it's impersonal, right? These forces are mechanistic. I mean, so that, yeah, that is not. So we got to think about that a little bit more. That no, these people believe that the fundamental reality is personal, right? We can commune with it. We can communicate with it, and maybe even it with us. Although maybe I would raise the question, like, how does the earth talk to you? And I mean, I would want to know, like, do trees really think about Tony Costello? Really? Like, I might think about the tree, and I might want to, sit in front of it and gaze at its beauty and wonder. But is the tree really thinking about me? I mean, that's a thought I've had. Like, I used to have, like, is this, tree or this grove really thinking about me or think about me when
Right.
I'm not there and dreaming about me, and does it
So
have intentions for me? You know,
so Anthony, this is interesting because last year when I'm doing the surveys, it's a physical paper survey. It's an old school style survey. You're taking a pen and you got a clipboard, the whole bit, and you're doing these interactions. My friend Basil, who was at another camp, and but he's still kind of he's incorporated with our group as well, but he camps at a different part of the city. He didn't have my physical survey, but to hand out, he didn't have the paper, but he had downloaded, I believe, the PDF of it onto his phone, and then he was asking questions verbally. And so where I was having people saying yes to, I believe that the earth is a living being, or to that effect, when he's verbally asking them to respond verbally to the question. It wasn't just simply, I agree or disagree. Now it was a massive justification, because if I have to say it, it actually kind of sounds stupid versus just
Romans
checking the
1:18.
box. I know.
Yeah,
I'm like,
1:18.
wow.
It is evident,
Yeah.
from the things of nature, right?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so our big fear is that, I guess it's not a big fear. It's just something that's in our mind, is we don't want to see outreach to the Neopagan community, the Burner Man community, the New Age community become something it's a soapbox. It can't be. There's got to be interaction. There has to be person to person interaction where we demonstrate respect, love, and grace with truth. All of that has to be in play.
I feel that there's a compromise that happens at the highest echelons of the church, if there is such thing as a highest echelon. And what I'm thinking about here is, I grew up Roman Catholic. So, and my whole family's still Roman Catholic. And I see this infiltrating into places like the Vatican. And if you read anything about the Amazon Synod in 2019 that was held in the Vatican, Pope Francis seems to be very cozy with this. I mean, he won't come out and say it directly, but I wrote a couple articles on the Amazon Synod in 2019. A lot of conservative Catholics are really worried about this. I think he's there. It's this one faithism is another term you use in the book, one faithism, this sort of universal religion, which we've been talking about the whole time. And, sometimes you see it in the church. So I want to just briefly ask if you have any sense of how maybe the one faithism, the one worldism, the oneism, the monism, the pantheism that we've been talking about has manifested itself in what we seems to be the confines of the church. If you have any thoughts on that, maybe you don't.
Oh, I do.
But anyways, okay, let me ask that.
Lots and lots.
Yeah, let me ask that. Okay, and
Okay.
then maybe we'll try and wrap up after that.
No problem. No problem. So, I go to the Parliament of World Religions. All right. This is where politics and religion comes together in a significant way. So this is the agenda book from the 2015 Parliament. Huge. 2015, of course, we had Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment. One of the workshops I went to was a pagan workshop asking the question, are we all pagans now? And so they read sections without saying where it came from. They read sections of their pagan declarations. Then they read sections of the encyclical and asked the question, right, and asked the question to the effect of can you tell the difference? Who wrote what? And everybody was like, no, fundamentally, there's no difference. And so, I mean, that's just one example. When I'm at the Parliament of World Religions and at other interfaith events, and I've been to a lot of them, the Christian community is there. And it is there as one with them. Rarely, if ever, do you hear a discussion about the uniqueness of Jesus Christ or the problem of Jesus, or let me put it this way. You will hear conversations about the problem of Jesus Christ, but you won't hear Christians backing that up to say he is exclusive because he's the author of life, the one who defeated death. You will not see Christians backing that idea up. Rather, you will have conversations like, what do we do with John 14:6? In fact, at the 2021 Parliament, which was virtual, and a really well done virtual platform for that matter, one of the big workshops was on engaging in what's called the John 14:6 project. How do we rewrite the meaning of John 14:6 as Christians? Here's another example. I come from a Mennonite background, all right? This is from MCC, Mennonite Central Committee, their 2000 report, Mennonite Central Committee, Women in Ritual. There's power in the blood, women, Christian ritual, and the blood mysteries. We are finding again the importance of our own bodies, whether through the blood of menstruation or the touch of another. We are reclaiming our ties to that great body upon which we dwell, Mother Earth. And then it has rituals, sections, and all. Just it's insane.
Yeah, I mean,
I can give you example after example.
I
So
know.
here's the
Yeah,
thing, Anthony.
yeah,
We have emulated the world.
that's right. Yeah,
We have not challenged their assumptions, and this goes back to this. We never challenged the assumptions. We
right.
accepted the blame and then capitulated and then compromised.
Yeah, and boy, I have tracked this in the Vatican and the Roman Catholic world a little bit. And of course, Pope Francis comes from Argentina, Bergoglio, and steeped in liberation theology. We already talked about a little bit of connection between critical theories and paganism. And I remember there was I think in 2016 there was a Earth Day event right in St. Peter's Square. You can find video of it where they displayed in holographic images or laser light show right on the cupola of St. Peter's Cathedral. I've been to many times because I lived in Rome. I think it said Mother Earth, Earth first. And then at the 2019 Amazon on the Synod, where they were putting pagan effigies of Pachamama in the church of Santa Maria Transpontina. And there was a couple of Austrian kids that came down, went into the church, grabbed the effigies, and threw them into the Tiber River in sort of reformational zeal. But here's another example for just for your notes. At the concluding mass of the Amazon Synod at St. Peter's, and people who understand Roman Catholic liturgy and the importance of the Eucharistic liturgy and the doctrine of transubstantiation, the offerings are brought up to the altar, and the offerings are the hosts that are going to be transubstantiated in the body of Christ, and the wine, or that's going to be transubstantiated in the blood of Christ. Well, they also had a woman from the Andes come up, and she was wearing her traditional headdress and a pot of dirt with some plants growing out of it from the Andes. And they didn't put it before the altar. They placed it on the altar next to the elements, and it stayed there to the very end of the service. In Catholic theology, at least, literally on the same altar as the body and blood of Jesus Christ. There was the sacred dirt. Now, if that's not a conflation of creator and creation, at
Right,
least in Catholic theology, then I don't know what is.
right. We're seeing the Christian community as a whole, and just going to paint that brush broadly, following suit. We follow the world.
And
So
Carl,
we have had a replacement. We focus on secularism without realizing that secularism is really nothing more than an in between period. It's a pause between
right?
one religion being rejected, Christianity, and a new religion coming in. And what will
Yeah,
that
I
new
think you
religion
quote
be?
somebody at the beginning of your book who says exactly that.
Yep,
It's just
yep.
a vacuum that's going to be filled. Actually, there's a T.S. Eliot pointed this out in 1939 in his Cambridge lectures. He said basically that any Western nation that rejects its Christianity will default to paganism, is basically his argument. And my concern, and this is why it's so important to get out there and talk to people, and grassroots change from the bottom up. It's so important because my concern, and maybe you'll disagree with this, I don't know, is that we talk about maybe people you encounter at Burning Man, and and they're spiritual seekers, and there's a journey there, and they're approachable, and we can talk to them. My concern, however, is that it does start to get dark.
Oh yeah,
It
and it
starts
will.
to get darker and darker as these pagan gods exert more and more force upon culture. And next thing you know, it's not just abortion, but it's sacrifices outside the womb of children. There's already a lawsuit in Texas, I believe, by a pagan group, a Wiccan group, I think, saying that abortion is a religious right. They're claiming religious grounds for the need for abortion. I'm like, it's not. I mean, you just look at what the Canaanites were doing, the Amorites, and like, how far away are we really? But we got to get into these communities.
Well, it will end up running into the realm of politics. It becomes political. So,
Right.
I mean, this is a convention on biological diversity. from 1992, from the 1992 Real Earth Summit, which had a deeply spiritual implication.
Yeah, these aren't even new documents. I mean,
Oh yeah.
1997. Yeah.
Boutros Ghali, when he closed off the Rio Summit, said that what we're doing is creating basically a new spiritual contract with nature. So as you read this document, it's 18 pages long, like 18 pages, whip-de-doo. It doesn't say much. It does talk about making protected zones and regulatory provisions. That 18 pages gets interpreted to this. Massive explanation on it's called the Global Biodiversity Assessment. But at the end of it, they went, we're missing a major part. We're missing the spiritual component. So that 18 pages gets 700 pages on European oversized paper, the cultural and spiritual values of biodiversity, which all eventually ends up back to our legislators, because our culture is now screaming for this, and we put this in play. We put it into policy. So I think my country's on the cutting edge of this, unfortunately. My government's on the cutting edge of this.
Yeah. Well, and we're in California, so.
Yeah, well, yeah. Just my Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, I think MAID right now is the third leading cause of death in Canada. I'd have to look up the stats again, but it's amazing. So he's putting, you put legislation in place for hate crimes that will vilify the very messages that you and I are now engaging in. And it comes ultimately through that backward step from politics to culture, from culture to philosophy, from philosophy to religion. We have a new religion. It's not the Christian religion. And it's going to play down right to the point of politics. And we're going to feel it at some point. Some of us already have. So to your point, Anthony, yeah. And that's where we're at. And Lenny, I really, really appreciated the perspective you bring with this is not the same as the early Christian age. We're reversing it.
Yeah.
And the
Very
church,
dangerous.
the church needs to grasp that. Desperately needs to grasp that.
Carl Teichrib, and the book again is, I'm going to hold it up here. I really want people to get this book and start reading it, or at least go to the website, which we'll link to. Forcing Change, right, Carl? That's the one.
Yep, you can do that. And gameofgods.ca also, you can go there too.
Yeah, and this is the issue. This is the issue of our times. And I so appreciate the work you've been doing and the engagements you've been involved in. And maybe I'll go on one with you. I really think that this is, we'll stay connected.
That'd be fun.
Because I got 3 little kids. And, I just sit here and I wonder what kind of, every parent wonders what kind of world their kids are going to be living in. I know.
We know what kind.
But with this, it's like, wow, we really want to start thinking about not just how to engage with pagans, but how are we going to raise our children? What should we be teaching them about now?
Huge importance. Hugely important.
Yeah. All right, Carl, thank you so much for joining us. We will do it again.
Yes, thank you.
God bless your work, your family. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. You guys have a great day.
Okay.
We will.
Cheers.
Thank you.